The atmosphere in the room was dense with tension that appeared to vibrate against the apartment's walls, a suffocating weight from which neither Will nor Dylan could escape. Will stood near the window, his back to the man who had, until a few hours earlier, provided solace and distraction from his life's crushing pressures. That same individual now posed the single biggest threat to everything Will had fought so hard to establish, particularly the delicate, growing trust he had with Electra. The silence between them was not a companionable quiet, but a tactical halt, a period when the echoes of their shared closeness felt like the ultimate betrayal. Will finally turned around, his gaze drawn to Dylan's face, looking for a glimmer of empathy, a flash of understanding, or just an indication that Dylan recognized the gravity of the situation. Every sense in Will's body warned him that he had made a fatal mistake, an impetuous decision motivated by a desperate need for connection that had now backfired spectacularly. He knew that if Electra discovered the truth, the life he envisioned would crumble to ashes. He moved closer to Dylan, his voice lowering to a low, jagged tremble. The appeal that had been burning in his throat suddenly came out, piercing and desperate. "Please," he muttered, barely audible but filled with fear. "Do not tell Electra that I slept with you." It wasn't a plea, it was a lifeline, a desperate attempt at steadiness in a world that seemed to be spinning off its axis. He watched Dylan's face, scared of what he would discover. Will there be spite? Will there be a smug sense of power? Or, more terrifyingly, would there be the icy indifference of someone who doesn't care about the consequences of their actions? The history of Los Angeles, where secrets were the currency of the elite and reputations were built in the crucible of controversy, weighed hard on both of them. They both recognized that in their circles, the truth was rarely as significant as how it was seen, and the perception of this particular truth would be nothing short of radioactive. Will felt the old tightening in his chest, the clawing anxiety that had characterized so much of his recent history. He tried to be a better man, the person Electra deserved, someone who wasn't always looking over his shoulder or keeping pieces of his soul in dark places. But the reality was that he was a man defined by his fractures, and the night with Dylan had been a lapse, a fleeting surrender to a loneliness so great that it overshadowed his rational thinking. He hadn't intended for it to imply anything, but he suddenly knew that its ambiguity was precisely what made it so dangerous. It was an impetuous, unmoored behavior that contradicted the story of his life, which he was desperately attempting to keep in line with Electra's expectations. Dylan stood motionless in the warm light of the room, like a statue, and Will had a scary moment where he considered laughing. The absurdity of the situation, the high-stakes drama of their personal lives playing out in this calm space, felt like something out of a soap opera, which defined their city's culture. However, this was not a screenplay. It was his life, and the stakes were real. He noticed a spark of something in Dylan's eyes, not rage, nor sympathy, but a complex mix of recognition and irritation. Dylan was also caught up in the web of these social expectations, possibly more so than Will. He grasped the game's rules. He understood that revealing this dalliance would not only hurt Will, but would also bring him into the middle of a tempest he did not want to navigate. Will continued, his words speeding up as terror threatened to boil over. He talked about Electra, the way she looked at him, and the optimism that began to grow in his heart whenever they were together. He offered a picture of a future that seemed tangible and attainable, assuming that this one precise, catastrophic variable could be contained. He attempted to appeal to whatever compassion remained between them, hoping that the relationship they had formed, however fleeting and ill-advised, would translate into some type of mercy. Dylan realized he was asking for an impossible request, one that would require him to essentially lie to the person with the most to lose. It was a request that robbed Will of his arrogance, exposing his fears on the floor before them. The history of the city, their shared circles, and the complex, often toxic dynamics of the people they interacted with all served as mute witnesses to their interchange. In a world of continual surveillance, social media scrutiny, and the hungry gaze of their peers, secrets were the only things they actually owned. However, the irony was that the secrets were the ones most likely to ruin them. Will walked the room, the beat of his footsteps accentuating the uneven cadence of his thoughts. He felt strong, piercing shame as he remembered Electra and how much she appreciated honesty. He wasn't simply asking Dylan to maintain a secret. He was asking him to take part in a deceit that would profoundly alter the basis of his relationship with her. Dylan finally moved, shifting his weight with steady, deliberate ease. He gazed at Will with a weary, knowing look, rather than the harshness he had dreaded. He did not give an immediate confirmation, only a commitment to keep silent. Instead, he considered the information as if it were a valuable asset in a high-stakes negotiation. The quiet stretched again, tense and unbreakable. Will stood motionless, his breath caught in his throat as he saw Dylan's expression. He was aware that his fate was being decided right now. He had given up all control, putting his future fully in the hands of the man who had been the cause of his ruin. Will realized that the tragedy was not simply the betrayal, but also his comfort in praying for silence. He had evolved into a man who relied on controlling narratives and manipulating appearances in order to survive. The vulnerability he felt was more than just about Electra. It was a revelation of how far he had strayed from the person he previously thought himself to be. He had become a character in the drama he had previously despised. He considered the possible consequences, how the murmurs would begin, how the truth would inevitably be twisted into something incomprehensible, a caricature of his blunders that would become his defining characteristic. He began to relate the events of the night, not to defend them, but to provide context for his desperation. He talked about loneliness, the crushing weight of expectation, and the feeling of being an outsider looking in on a life he didn't truly belong to. He wanted Dylan to understand that it was not truly about him. It was about Will's inability to deal with the strain of having to be perfect for someone else. Even his own words felt empty as they came out. He understood that whatever of the reasons, the consequence would be the same. A deep, irreparable stain on his character. Dylan eventually spoke, his voice cold and detached against Will's frenetic energy. He explained the complexities of the scenario and how Electra was linked to so many others in their orbit. He mentioned the danger and how a secret like this had a propensity to boil to the surface, regardless of their efforts to keep it hidden. He wasn't specifically promising to keep it, but he wasn't making any threats. The ambiguity was the most agonizing. Will recognized Dylan had the leverage, and he would use it in any way suited his own purposes. The conversation veered into the past, bringing up previous instances of mutual vulnerability, other times when they had let their guard down. They shared a strange, perverse connection, acknowledging that they were two flawed individuals attempting to navigate a society that required wholeness. They were both aware that this secret would now hang between them indefinitely, regardless of the outcome. It would serve as a reminder of the night, of their regret, and of the fragile nature of everything they attempted to defend. Will experience sudden, deep fatigue. The adrenaline that had kept him going throughout the confrontation was receding, leaving a cold, hollow void in his chest. He looked around the room, where he had intended to find refuge, and realized it now seemed like a jail. He saw Dylan as a reflection of his own failures, rather than a friend or lover. He recognized that even if Dylan vowed silence and Electra never found out, the secret would remain, a ticking clock that he could never really silence. He was always waiting for the other shoe to drop, looking for the glint of mistrust in Electra's eye. He reflected about the future, the possibilities he had imagined, and how they now felt like a delicate, lovely mirage. He sought to build something real, but he did so on sand. The understanding struck him with the force of a physical blow. He was not only losing his opportunity with Electra, but also his chance at redemption. He had attempted to erase his previous mistakes, only to construct a new, more convoluted one that would, in the end, most certainly define him. He took one last look at Dylan. There was nothing more to say. The plea had been made, the desperation expressed, and the vulnerability revealed. The remainder was outside of his hands. He returned his gaze to the window, watching the city lights blur in the distance, a cold, distant constellation that seemed utterly unrelated to the turmoil in his inner existence. He waited there, a man torn between the want to be loved and the fear of being seen for who he truly was, waiting for a signal that never came, a sign that he might be able to go on with his life, as if this night had never occurred. The city continued its indifferent churn, oblivious to the small, quiet tragedy unfolding in the room, where one man's plea for silence would ripple outward, potentially altering the trajectories of several lives, a testament to how, in the world of the bold and the beautiful, the smallest choice could trigger the most devastating disaster. The weight of his axe pressed against his bones, a dull, throbbing reminder of the fragility of the tranquility he desired. He wondered if Electra would ever look at him again and recognize the man she thought she knew, or if she would always see this phantom version of him, made of secrets and shadows. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had desperately wanted to be the hero of her story, but instead, he had become the cautionary tale. He considered simply leaving, packed a bag, and walking away from everything, the city, Electra, and the toxic cycle he had become locked in. But he realized it was a delusion. He was as much a prisoner of his circumstances as he was of his own decisions. The silence became heavy again, more oppressive than before. It was the stillness of a secret kept, a secret that could blow at any time. Will turned slightly, catching a sight of himself in the mirror. A man he didn't recognize, his eyes wide with frenzied, desperate emotion. He appeared to have just stared into the abyss and been startled to discover that it was peering back at him. He recognized then that the secret wasn't only about Electra, it was about the part of himself he was attempting to conceal, the portion capable of making such a self-destructive decision. He had always considered himself a survivor, capable of navigating life's obstacles with ease. But this was different. This was a direct assault on his inner identity, an internal split that he didn't know how to mend. He began to consider what he would say and explain if the truth was revealed. To keep the illusion alive, he would have to tell lies, make up justifications, and build layers of deception. It was a terrifying prospect, a lifetime of care for an already leaning edifice. He looked at Dylan again, who had stayed mute while processing the request. The tension persisted, a palpable, vibrating force that appeared to imbue the air with an electric, unpleasant energy. It was evident that the conversation had ended, but neither of them moved. They were caught up in the aftermath of the event, the silent reverberations of an already taken decision, even though the words of agreement had not yet been said. Will experienced an unusual sense of clarity in the stillness. It was a cold, harsh, and cruel clarity, the type that only arrives when there is no turning back. He recognized that the life he desired was probably already gone, regardless of what happened next. The act of begging for the secret to be kept was enough to destroy the person he wanted to be. He had crossed a line, altering the nature of his existence. He was no longer the guy who lived for the future. He was the man who was bound by the secret of his past, which now comprised this night, this chamber, and the man who stood before him, the guardian of his demise. The city outside continued to buzz, a symphony of activity and sounds that felt increasingly disconnected from the silence of the room. He recognized that, even if everything went flawlessly, if the secret stayed hidden, the burden would fall solely on his shoulders. He would be the one who lived with the truth, managed the deception, and was always aware of his actions. And that, he knew, was the ultimate significance of it. The secret was not a burden to be shared with Dylan. It was a weight he had taken for himself, a debt he would have to pay for the rest of his life. He closed his eyes for a brief period, wishing he could go back, cancel the urge, and erase the memory of the night. But there was no eraser for the human experience, and he was left to stand in the wreckage of his own design, waiting for the consequences to manifest in the slow, agonizing way that life often chooses, unaware that while he feared the exposure of his secret, the real destruction had already taken place inside, in the quiet, empty space where his integrity used to be, a space now filled with the cold, hard reality of his own making, a secret that he would carry forward. The night had already lasted much longer than either of them imagined. What had begun as a simple evening, just a drink, a talk, and a quiet retreat from the never-ending whirl of family expectations, had evolved into something more complicated, something neither of them seemed prepared to confront in the harsh light of dawn. The quiet between them felt heavier than anything they'd said the night before. Will stood near the window, his arms clasped firmly, as if he could hold himself together with pure effort. Outside, the early morning light crawled across the skyline, slow and merciless. He hadn't gotten much sleep, actually. The previous night's recollections replayed in his memory, each one loaded with equal parts warmth and sadness. Dylan sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the floor. There was something fragile about the way he held himself, as if one incorrect word could destroy the fragile peace in the room. Finally, Will spoke. "Please," he pleaded quietly, his voice carrying the strain that had been building throughout the morning. "Don't tell Electra that I slept with you." The words hung in the air, like a confession neither of them wanted to completely admit. Dylan raised his head slowly. His demeanor was neither angry nor completely calm. It was confusing, as if someone recognized the gravity of the situation but didn't know what it meant for either of them. "You think I'm going to dash up to her and say it?" Dylan inquired. Will sighed and moved away from the window. "I don't know what you're going to do." "That's not really fair." "Nothing about this is fair," Will told you. The tension between them was not limited to the night they had shared. It was about all that came before it, the friendships, loyalty, and hidden expectations that had formed their entire lives. Electra was more than simply another individual in their universe. She was someone who meant a lot to both of them, and she trusted them in ways that now felt vulnerable. Dylan stood and took a few steps forward, keeping a watchful distance. "You're acting like this was some terrible accident," the man replied. "Wasn't it?" Will responded. Dylan laughed quietly, but there was no comedy about it. "Do you really want to call it that?" Will hesitated, because the truth was more complex. It had not been an accident. They had spoken for hours the night before. At start, it was about basic things, the turmoil of their lives, the pressure of living under constant scrutiny, and the sense that everyone expected them to perform roles they never completely desired. But sometime along the road, the conversation changed. They had began discussing loneliness. And that's when everything changed. Will scratched his face with both hands now, attempting to block out the memories that kept returning. "I care about Electra," he said. "I know you do," Dylan replied. Dylan bent his head slightly. "That's the problem. You think caring for her implies you can't feel anything else? That is not what I am saying." "So, what are you saying?" Will struggled with the words. He'd always tried to do the right thing, even when it meant denying elements of himself that were difficult to understand. But the night before had slipped through their barricades. And now everything seemed uncertain. "I'm saying," Will continued cautiously, "that if she finds out about this, it's going to hurt her." Dylan studied him attentively. "You're presuming she'd perceive it the same way you do. What does it mean?" "It indicates this could be about your guilt rather than her sentiments." Will scowled. "Do you honestly think this is simple?" "No," Dylan replied gently. "But I don't think pretending it never happened will make it any better." The room grew silent again. Outside, the city was awakening. Cars drove through the streets, people went about their regular activities, and the world continued as if nothing had changed. But inside the apartment, everything felt different. Will walked across the room and sat in the chair opposite the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I never planned for this," he said. "Most things that matter aren't planned," Dylan said. "That doesn't make them any easier." Dylan took a time to study him. "You regret it?" The question lingered in the air. Will did not respond immediately, because regret was not the appropriate term. Confusion, perhaps. Fear, undoubtedly. But is there any regret? He was unsure. "I regret that it's complicated," he finally said. Dylan nodded slowly. "That is what I believe." For a little period, the tension eased. They had always been able to communicate openly, without the masks they wore for everyone else. Perhaps that was part of what brought them here in the first place. However, honesty can sometimes be harmful. "Electra trusts us," Will stated gently. "Yes. And if she finds out about this from someone else," Dylan said.